You are without doubt the worst pirate I've ever heard of.
But you have heard of me.
So, do you, like I, feel like there is not enough Pirates of the Caribbean themed dioramas out there? Well, fear not, ladies and gentlemen. I am here to provide that service for you today. Welcome back to the channel for those of you who have been here. For those of you who are new here, I am very delighted to welcome you to my channel. So, I decided to base my diorama around Port Royal, the first settlement that we meet in the Pirates of the Caribbean, the first movie. And there are some quite distinct features here. You have the big fortress up on the left side here, and the city township in the middle, and the governor's building or residence over on the right side, and a lot of ships docked around in the port. And I made a layout here, as you can see, what I'm hoping to get. It's just sort of a plan, which I usually do, and attempt to stick to it this time. So, let's dive headfirst into the fortress. I made a separate little sketch for the fort and cut out this block of styrofoam. There's going to be a gallows here, there's going to be some gun platform, and some space for the battery. So, I just started with my X-Acto knife, as I usually do, and then I'm going to be extra careful with using my hand to obscure the camera as much as I possibly can. That's a party trick I'm pretty damn good at this point. But it's very simple, straightforward. You just slice out some pieces, and I have done some measurements. This is scale 1 to 700, so it's very small scale. But I'm just doing my best here and attempting to make the windows and doors and gangways looks at least appropriate for another figure in 1 to 700 scale. It's quite approximate. This is no exact measurements. As you can see, I'm just trying my best here with my hand, and well, it works out most of the time, at least. I just tested this on another block I had laying around, you know, just for trying to come up with some ideal sizes, and found that these arches looked pretty good. And I carved them out with a knife as well, and just had to remove them in chunks with a screwdriver, amongst other things. But let's move on to other things. These are some of the buildings that I made for the diorama, and the same thing goes here. Did some simple measurements, started with that, and then I just carved out some small buildings with a knife. A lot of these were just experimental. I didn't really have a scale, so some of them I built in completely wrong scale. I built them in 1 to 350 more or less, so I had to scale most of them down for a second attempt. As you can see here, some of them have more details than others. This is some sort of mill of some sort. I googled some of the buildings that were used in the movie, but found that I just prefer making random stuff, as I usually do. Same goes with the fortress. It is a ridiculous construction if you pay attention in the movies. The walls of the fortress are extremely high, and like it's the masonry, it's probably 40-50 meters up, sticking out the rock. So I decided to replicate that here. In other news, though, I made this absolutely beautiful cathedral. I think I spent almost 2 hours on this cathedral before realizing that it's huge. It's way too big. It took up way too much space in the allotted space I had in the diorama. So this is not going to be a part of this diorama, sadly, so I just got to place it in another build some other times. But here, another building that did make the cut. This is the governor's building, where we meet Elizabeth Swann and the governor. We don't meet them, but this is their residence. You know what I mean. You've seen the movies, most likely. So I can already see you furiously typing in the comments, where do you get that ship model? That's a beautiful little ship. And yes, it is. This is from a game called Black Seas, produced by Warlord Games, and it is a 1 to 700 scale brig, I believe. It's going to be my model of the Interceptor, and as you can see, it's been docked up next to these two cranes, which, if you have seen the movies, do become quite relevant in a particular scene where a certain Captain Jack Sparrow escaped from Commodore Norrington and the Redcoats. So, yeah, those are here as well. So moving forward, I decided to add this foam board just to add some elevation to the diorama, make some artificial hills and stuff, and I did my usual thing and just got out some plaster and tried rubbing it into the board, but it turns out these foam boards, you can't stick anything to them, so I had to remove all the plaster, then get a piece of sandpaper and sand the entire thing down. I didn't think of that at all when I first did it, but of course the surface of the foam board, nothing's going to stick to it, not even paint. So I had to remove all that, then get back to the plaster, which I spread over the entire surface. But when it came to the fortress, which was kind of a rough job as well, I just used some plaster that I watered down and diluted with water and just poured it into the fortress like this, which made a rather even surface inside the fort eventually when it dried. So yeah, made a nice surface, got some textures on there, and it looked pretty good. I'm very pleased with that, how it turned out. So here is the general layout of the diorama. You have the fortress up on the left, the town and village in the centre on the right side, and this tiny crop island down in the other side. And I am going to use resin again on this diorama. I haven't had much luck with resin so far in my diorama career. It always ends up pouring out everywhere when I don't want it to be. But I needed some more elevation, so I'm just going to get a lot of glue and a piece of cardboard and glue it to this piece of plywood that is going to form the base of my diorama, just to get a bit more elevation, and voila, here you have the new layout. And this I'm going to test fit. I do this regularly, by the way. I test fit everything just to see if there are enough buildings, if I need more structures anywhere, if I'm pleased with how it looks, and just to get a feeling of where things are heading. But now we move on to painting. I just use some regular different shades of blue, where I'm going to, which I buy very cheaply on my local hobby store, and I'm just going to squirt a bit of this deep dark blue. Sorry, I'm going to use the dark blue in the areas where the water is deep, and we're going to use the lighter blue further towards the shoreline, just to get an effect that the water is deeper the further you get from shore. Again, I am using colored paints that are quite cheap. I think they cost about £1 each for these quite large bottles, and I use them for a base coat more or less everywhere on most of my builds. And as you can see here, I'm done with the darker blue, and I've left a little piece further closer to the shore and the beach. I use this light blue, and I'm just going to mix the two paints together so that you get a smooth transition, smooth and blurry transition from the dark blue to the light blue, and hopefully it's going to look pretty good once it's covered by a layer of coloured resin at least. So yeah, not too bad. I think I illustrated I think I got the contrast that I wanted, and it looks pretty good. There's a bit of a sharp edge between the light and dark blue, but you know, it's fine. Just ignore the white rectangle down in the left corner. That was supposed to be a dock. I didn't go for that anyway. But here you can see I've started to paint everything else, the terrain at least. There's going to be mostly sandbanks and sand dunes, I think. That's going to be the primary colour, as far as I remember from the movie at least. And I'm going to use this grey, which I just knocked over, to paint most of the rocks. I'm going to use a darker grey first. This is a German grey, I believe, and I'm going to use the light grey afterwards to highlight with a dry brush coat after that. And I'm also going to use it on the fortress, but as of now I'm just going to paint the rocks and the mountain sides. This took a little bit of time. It was quite tricky after I had worked over the styrofoam with the pliers and scalpels and everything to get paint into all the nooks and crannies. Took a bit of time, but I think I got most of it. I did consider using some primer, but I have had accident with spray paint from spray cans earlier, because it melts the styrofoam, and I felt I had already gotten too far on this project for this to start melting. But as you can see, here is what I'm talking about with the dry brush coat, and it brings out a lot of very nice details on the rock, and I really feel that things come alive when you use this dry brush coat. Just put a bit of a small amount of paint on the brush, remove most of the paint with a toilet paper, and then you just go about it like this, and the result is pretty good. I'm very pleased with it, at least. So let's move on to the rest of the town. I've sped up the footage a bit because it's getting quite repetitive after a while, but I'm starting to paint the rest of the houses, and what I did was I painted a lot of the houses, the roofs red, and a lot of the buildings in different colours, as you can see here. I tried to vary a lot, well, quite a lot, I think, at least, between the different buildings, because I wanted the different houses in the village to have different colours, just for it to look a bit more lively. Maybe most of the houses in this time period would be the same colour. Maybe they'd all be of some sort of limestone or some sort of wood or something. But I chose to paint all of them in different colours. So as you can see, it just looks a bit more interesting, hopefully at least. Also, for some of the houses I needed a bit more detail because it looked a bit boring and a little bit uninteresting and not very alive, so I just grabbed a pen and drew on the details that I felt was missing. I drew on a lot of doors and a lot of windows on a lot of them, and I also attempted to draw some Tudor-like timbers and stuff like that, particularly here on the governor's building. I tried drawing on a window, a pretty large one at least. Wasn't very successful, but the smaller ones out on the sides, I had already carved them up with my knife, so I just filled in with the pen like that. But you know, I tried drawing on this big door, and it was semi-successful, not terribly well executed. The sprues are, well, as you can see, it's fine. It's such a small scale anyway, so you're not really going to notice them. So it looks good from a distance at least. On other buildings, again, I found a need for more details as well. So on this brick building, I used a toothpick, and which I very gently dipped in some darker paint, and then drew on some individual bricks. You know, it's not have to be very accurate, and it's probably not in the right scale, but just gives some variation and more detail, so it looks a bit more nice and a bit more interesting. So a couple of colours. I used a light and a darker tone here, as you can see. Some of them had red brick, some of them had white, and it's just to bring a little bit of further details and multiculturalism, more or less, to the build. And once that was done, I just glued everything in place. As I briefly mentioned earlier, I just used a piece of plywood that I was laying around for a base of this diorama. The edges doesn't look very nice, so I used a piece of balsa wood which I glued on the edges all around the diorama just for it to have a nicer finish. Now, I decided to continue my quest for further details, so I used some highly diluted grey paint to try and painting in some path and put paths like that from the different buildings. Didn't turn out to be very visible once everything was done, but anyway, it was an attempt at least. But something that will become more visible is this. I'm going to start using this shrubbery to form the scenery and bushes and the trees around in Port Royal. So I just dipped them in some PVA glue and glued them in randomly all around the village, more or less, next to some buildings out in the open. And I also used some roots that I collected earlier this year that have been dried out to form trees, which I also randomly just scattered around and eventually added some more foliage on top to make them look like trees. As you can see here, this is just a picture I took midway. You can see the trees just scattered randomly all around the place, and also over here next to the fort there are some bushes on the cliffs and some trees. Again, just random pattern, nothing fancy. Right, we are moving on to what some of you have been waiting for and what I have been dreading. It is the resin. If you have watched my other video with the DeLorean time machine diorama, you will know that I fucked up the resin for that pretty badly and ended up pouring resin all over my desk because it leaked. So I thought I'd done a thorough job on this one. I taped everything, I used styrofoam to cover everything up, and yeah, it worked really well. This time I did everything right. So I poured everything out with a high level of confidence, and yes, it is just as satisfying as it looks. Pouring resin is absolutely fantastic, especially after you've done a very good job masking things off, because you have to do that, or else you will end up with the same thing as I did when I poured resin into my DeLorean diorama. It just filters out in the smallest cracks and you can't really see them. So what you should be doing is to add a very thin layer of resin with a brush, I believe, so to cover it up before you pour the main load. I did not do that here, of course, because I thought, hey, it's just going to be a very thin layer anyway, and it doesn't really matter because it's not going to pour out all over the floor because I've done a very thorough job. And as you can see here, I hadn't, and resin went everywhere for the second time. 100% failure rate on resin so far. Fantastic. I saw it instantly when I came into my garage to check it out, and I can see the level of resin had dropped dramatically, and it had poured everywhere out on this, thankfully, cardboard that I laid out, because I did anticipate this, because I've already fucked it up once, so why shouldn't I do it twice? Great. So everyone, let's get ready for round 2. I realised a couple of more things were missing to my diorama, so I cut out some pieces of balsa wood like this and decided to make some docks. Or, well, something that looked like docks at least. I just used these also in a random pattern. As you can see, I made some different variants, and with some support beams underneath, they got a bit of distance from the surface of the water as well. And after painting these up, they looked pretty nice, and with the second layer of resin, that also turned out very good. Sadly, I did forget to take any footage of painting the ships. Sorry about that. It went very easily. As you can see, it's not a very difficult paint job, it's just very small scale. But the docks here, you can see, they look really nice. So yeah, pretty pleased with these. Now, while the resin surface looks absolutely stunning and like glass, it looks a little bit boring. So I'm going to use this gel that I bought, well, years ago, but it still holds perfectly fine. And I'm going to use this to create some water and wave effects on the resin. I just put a, well, generous amount on a brush and just go like this, trying to emanate what movements of the waves would look like when it would be when it would heading toward the shore, and just rough it up a bit. Just again, apply it in random patterns that, well, could look like sea, more or less. Now this is what it looked like when it's drying, and you are petrified for a while, thinking, have I just ruined it? But this is what it looked like after about half an hour, and as you can see, it's not completely dry here yet, but it looks a lot better. And yeah, very happy with that. Here you can see it's almost completely dried, and we are now adding some final details near the interceptor. There's the crane again. So yeah, looking pretty good. What do you think? I think the interceptor turned out pretty good, and although it's not cinematically accurate for what the scene looks like in Pirates of the Caribbean, amongst other things, Jack Sparrow runs over a stone bridge at some point. But hey, this is my interpretation. This is as good as it's going to get. Like I already said several times, working with the resin, I haven't really gotten the hang of it yet. So this is after I removed all the styrofoam support and the tape that I put on. As you can see, resin has gone a little bit everywhere. But what irritated me is this ruined part of the balsa wood I had put on. I didn't put it on the back side yet, but yeah, on the underside you can see where the resin went. I really did think that this was going to do the trick, but it didn't. So let's get the sander and sand everything down. And as you can see, it did an amazing job. I started with some pretty... I can't remember the grits I used on this, but it was very, very hardcore to begin with. And then I moved on to something with a finer grit, and then a very, very fine grit at the end. And then I applied varnish to the edges, just to make it look a little more shiny. In addition to that, I have some more parts. Also, these were from the same supplier that I bought the ships from. And this one accessory kit, which I struggle with getting into frame. And I don't know if you can see it at all, but it is a cannon in 1/700 scale. It is absolutely tiny, but the details on it are magnificent. So after painting these, they turned out to be really, really good. And then there were some guns there, there were some chests there, and there were some stacks of cannonballs, and they turned out absolutely beautifully once painted. And once that was done, I just applied them to the fort and glue them in place with super glue. And you can see that it's absolutely tiny, but it looks absolutely wonderful. And there's the first one in place, and whoops, there we go. There they all are. Beautiful. Television magic is absolutely fantastic. So that's the fortress done, and here's an overview of the town. And yeah, that too turned out pretty good. Very happy with that as well. Finally, here is a bit of a close-up of one of the ships I added in. In the movie there are a lot of random ships, and this I just had to paint. I had to include it. It looks beautiful. With that, it was out to the final detail, painting the base of the diorama, and then I glued the ships in place, and that was it. So let's have a look at the final reveal. So, that is it. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you liked it. Please leave a like if you did, and I'll see you next time.